Okay, I just realized that I forgot to turn on the mic. So, hey everyone, welcome to Age of Reason. Alright, I was just checking if it's working. Now it's okay. So, welcome to another interesting episode of Age of Reason. We're at the beginning of November 2018. And just before we start into today's show of the content, I'd like to just briefly talk about the format of the show. So, I used to invite another host here, so we would have two people. Sometimes I wasn't even on the show. And what's going on is that I'm actually my health situation is not great, so it's difficult for me to go get the people, and even if that's not too complicated, setting up here the studio is very complicated and demanding. So for now it's just going to be me. Of course, in the future I am open to having more hosts like we used to, but for now it's just going to be me, which was the original point of the show anyway. It's to promote the podcast and, well, ultimately to promote myself as well. So today I'd like to briefly start with the book, and I see there's a massive reflection there, so probably not a good idea to hold it up there. Please get my book, Beyond the Obscure. It's a great book. It's a psychological horror thriller story, and I know that some people don't like the genre, perhaps, but there's a lot of stuff in this book for everybody. Um, okay, it is rated 18 over, definitely, but there's a lot of stuff in here for everybody, so do give it a read. Beyond the Obscure. There will be links in the description. Let's get this out of the way as well. Okay, so today what I'd like to talk about is the US midterms very briefly, and then I'm going to talk about climate change, and in particular there's an article about the new Brazilian president, which I'd like to cover. So why don't we jump into that? Okay. So before we start, let's start with a bit of comedy, I guess. And this is a picture that I posted on the page a week or two ago. It's this, I don't know, I just like to call him Farmer Joe. So Farmer Joe is holding a sign here, and the sign says, "Don't be comic conned." So the comic convention, the com convention, right? Your life is not fiction. Get real with Jesus. It's so ironic. So he's the guy who's getting conned, and he's telling other people to not get conned by other stuff. Well, actually, if you think about it, let's take Batman, for example. Batman is basically a guy who wears an armored suit and is basically a rich guy. Well, that's believable, at least. Okay, it doesn't happen in real life, but it is believable. Superman, for example, is not believable. Batman is believable. So who would I rather believe, Batman or Jesus? Definitely Batman. Anyway, I just thought it would be funny to comment on that very quickly. So let's go into the meat here, and so let's talk about the midterms briefly. First of all, like I said on the Age of Reason news show, I was not at all surprised by the results. Really, there was nothing that surprised me at all. We have the Republican Party, and we know what they do. We have the Democratic Party, and basically since the last presidential election, the Democratic Party has really done very little to go in the direction of the people. They appointed Tom Perez as the DNC chair, and they purged a bunch of progressives from leading positions. So to say that the Democratic Party, represents some kind of progressive movement is just not right. So this article focuses on the millennials, and I just want to say right off the bat, I don't understand why we always seem to elevate millennials to some kind of special pedestal. They are just basically kids. We were kids. I mean, I was a kid not that long ago, so for me it's quite recent. So why do we elevate millennials to some kind of special pedestal? What is so special about these people today? Are they any different from people like me, for example, when I was 18, 17, something like that? I don't think so. Do they know more than me? That's questionable too. But the article says that record turnout, question mark, not for millennials, just a third say they'll vote. And that actually happens most of the time. Every time, if I remember correctly, it's hard to get millennials to vote. The culture today is, you know, Facebook and forums and stuff like that. So let's show action with words, perhaps. So let's post some message on the internet, but let's not actually make a physical effort to like go and vote somewhere. But of course, there's another reason for that, and the article gets into that. So we'll move to that. Before we jump into the article, there's this curious thing I found posted many times right after the midterms, and it says, just in case you need some positives from the midterms, here's some stats. And for example, we have the first black congresswoman from Massachusetts, 2 first Native American women ever elected, one lesbian, okay. First openly gay governor in Colorado, Indiana, Alabama elected a gay representative to state. Okay, so this is all very good from like a social point of view. It's great for like the LGBT community, but again, I don't understand why we elevate these people just because they are gay, or just because they are black, or just because they are lesbian. Shouldn't we judge people based on their ideas? It could be a gay person, but with the most horrible ideas ever. So yeah, he might be gay, and he might be the first gay person elected to some kind of position, but he might hold absolutely awful views on climate change or, you know, immigrant policy. I mean, Ted Cruz, right? Ted Cruz is basically this guy who, by today's definition of some redneck Americans, let's say, he would not be considered an American, and yet he's the white supremacist guy. So that's one paradox right there. But this article is a little bit better, and this comes from businessinsider.com. So this one says, of course, it does include also that fact that they were, you know, Muslim women and Somali American and all of that. That's fine. But this article makes a more deep point that there will be more scientists too. There's one physicist, one microbiologist, one chemist, 8 engineers, mathematician. There's some medical people in there as well. So that is much better. It's much better to mention this type of stuff than just mention the fact that they're gay, or just the fact that they're black, or just the fact that they're Asian or whatever. This is more important. This has more substance. This is what I care about. Apparently, it's not what people care about, though. So let's talk about the millennials. And so we start off with a poll here, and it says, how likely are you to vote in the midterm election? Definitely will vote is about 30, so that's why they said about a third of the millennials will definitely vote, and then 26% probably will vote. And then you go into the kind of, so it's in 2 halves for me, this poll, and the second half starts from uncertain and goes all the way down. So we go 23%, 12, and 7. So if you add it all up, it's about 40%. So 40% probably will not vote. Okay, let's just kind of cut the crap here, and let's just say like uncertain is probably not gonna vote, most likely, and then the categories below that is just almost guaranteed not gonna vote. So that's a lot of people not voting. So it says here that yeah, basically the main reason is disengagement heading into November. So that's what I've been saying at the beginning of this show. The Democratic Party has done nothing really to unite people. They don't have any cause that is uniting people. So if you go back to the election, Well, Bernie Sanders had at least, I know perhaps some of his stuff may be unrealistic, although, you know, we spend a lot on war, and if you just take that money, for example, and you reinvest it into healthcare and education, you actually cover both, and you still have leftover. So when people say like his ideas are unrealistic, well, think about where the money is going right now. Are you happy with it? So disengagement, well, Bernie Sanders at least had a clear message. He tried to unite the people. And we know that, of course, the Republican Party, we know what they stand for. There's nothing new there at all. But we need a party that actually properly presents a message. And we don't have that. The Democratic Party is not it. There's the second poll here. How well does Congress represent people like you? Both polls, if you look at the numbers, they're more or less identical. So let's just consider they're the same for the argument's sake. And very well, only 3%. So only 3% of millennials are actually happy with what the Congress is doing. That just shows you how well Congress is doing. Somewhat well is like 32%. So again, a third think it's okay, but could be better. And then really you have to look at the last two. So not too well and not at all well, which is the overwhelming majority here, 2/3. Again, it just says a lot about how Congress is doing. Not well. This one I found interesting, but it's very vague, this one. So again, you have to be careful with polls because some polls are extremely vague. And just reopen the chat here. By the way, feel free to chat and comment while I'm talking because it adds to the conversation. So this poll, it basically asks which candidate quality matters most. And the most important here is can bring needed change. But again, that's very vague because they don't mention which change. I mean, I want a certain change, but maybe you want another type of change. So then it's vague. You have to be specific. Shares my values. I like this one. Well, again, what does it mean? What values? I mean, again, I have some values, but a lot of people have other values. For religious people, Jesus, for example, is a great value. For me, it's really not. It's one of the worst values. Honest and trustworthy, 19. That's interesting. I would like to think that I would like a person to be honest and trustworthy, a person especially who represents my interests. But apparently that's not what matters to people the most. Cares about people like me. So this one is a bit more kind of selfish. It's like me, me, me. Again, what do you mean exactly about yourself? The right experience, I don't even know what that means. I hope it's not right-wing experience. Okay, so now the second part here, I would mostly like to talk about climate change, and in particular there was this article posted. So the reason why I talk about this to begin with is because when I was posting climate change related articles on my page, what I noticed is that, as an admin, I have access to certain numbers that people don't see, and I noticed that the reach, for example, on climate change post was extremely low. It was maybe the highest I've ever seen was 1,000, but compare that to memes and some other articles, it's really a tiny fraction. So I just think people don't, okay, so basically people don't read these articles. And I think they are good articles, and I'm just going to talk about this one today because, well, it's quite interesting. The article is titled, "Could One Man Single-Handedly Ruin the Planet?" And it's by David Wallace Wells. We have a picture here. It's from Brazil. It's from the Amazon forest being destroyed. It looks like something out of an apocalyptic movie, really. I actually didn't, I thought it was some kind of tsunami at the beginning. It looks like it from the surface, but it's actually burnt forest, a lot of it. And the Amazon forest, as we all know, is very important. It is a major provider of oxygen, in the world. And of course, as I'll talk later, forests acts as a carbon sink. So we have oceans that act as a carbon sink, but forests as well. And so when we cut forests, we actually, just checking the mic here, we actually lose some potential. So let's jump into the article. First of all, I just want to show this graph because people seem to not really grasp the idea of climate change very well. And I strongly urge you to take some kind of courses on online. There is, Coursera, there is edX. There are good courses on both related to climate change. So please check them out. Occasionally I take them, so I might bump into you sometimes in those forums. And you don't have to take the assignments if you don't. Sometimes I don't have the time either. So I don't do the certificate course. So then you don't have to do the assignments. You don't have to do the homework, but you can still follow through all the lectures. And sometimes that's good enough for me, because sometimes the essays and stuff like that, I just don't have the time to really sit down and think about it. So anyway, so what people don't seem to understand is that they think that the pollution is basically from like this year, like right from 2018, right? But in reality, it doesn't work like that at all. In reality, the pollution and the carbon in the atmosphere and the methane in the atmosphere and other gases like that are accumulated. It's a cumulative effect. So the graph here shows three things. On the left side, I just want to not confuse the sides here. On the left side, there is a graph from 1750 to 2011. So it's basically roughly the start of the Industrial Revolution until today. And what you'll see on this graph is that it goes up quite slowly at the beginning. It's still like manageable. And then you got World War I that happens. So you have that first spike around there, 1914, 1918. There is a kind of flat area after that. And then you got World War II, which is another actually short spike. But the main spike happens right after that. So the population exploded. And a lot of people don't even want to touch that problem either, the problem of overpopulation. We have too many people in the world. There are some articles on the internet that talk about it, but most sources are extremely conservative when it comes to the population. My guess is that they don't want to offend people too much. I know that people then start to say, well, what do you want then, like a genocide or something? Look, it's going to happen anyway. I don't want a genocide. I don't want to kill anybody. I don't want to start a war. But this is coming, whether you want it or not. So you see a major spike after 1950 until today. And the reason for that, again, is so population exploded. And if you look at the curve of CO2 and the population growth, they actually almost are parallel to each other. They go hand in hand. So you have more people, you have more CO2. That's one thing. We all consume more. So it's just common sense. Now the graph on the right, it shows the fossil cement and stuff like that per chunk. And so the first chunk, like again, we go back to the first graph, 1750 to 1970, more or less. It's like manageable. And then if you expand that, so 1750 to 1990, you just added 20 years, but look at the difference. It's 500. And then if you add 20 years more to that, it's plus 600. So you can see how fast the change is happening, and the Earth does not have the mechanisms to adjust to such fast changes. The rate of change is what we're talking about. The rate is unmanageable. So the article starts, in between the election's first round and the runoff, Bolsonaro, so that's the Brazilian president name, who has called so this is kind of a background about the guy himself first. He called having a daughter a weakness. So he must be a Bible thumper or something, because, being a woman in the Bible is inferior. I mean, it's made clear on almost every page. Told another legislator he wouldn't rape her because she was not worthy of it. Well, that's nice. That's a nice father there. Said he'd rather have his children be drug addicts than gay, and endorsed torture. Actually retreated from his promise to withdraw his country from the Paris Accords. So I know that some people were recently. I saw some posts. Hey, like, why is this guy so bad? Why is protecting one country from, let's call, a pure race a bad idea? Well, actually, this is a huge part why. A huge part. We don't want to go back to the days of Nazis in particular. Let me resize this for a second. So here we go. This is the forest carbon cycle in a simplified way. So what we have here is basically the carbon. So the carbon from the atmosphere, that's the arrow going down here, the blue arrow. That's the carbon from the atmosphere going down into the forest in this case. So this diagram does not include the oceans and the lakes so much. So the forest emit CO2 via decomposition. The next diagram will show that a little bit better. And of course, fires also contribute to that. You got the huge arrow there from the fossil fuels. And this particular picture talks only about Europe, so between 1990 to 2005. So here, if you actually calculate all the numbers, you'll notice that the arrows going up are almost double what the arrows going down are. And I know it doesn't include the lake and ocean here, but that's it's just something to bear in mind. So the next picture here kind of explains the previous picture more. So what happens is that if you have a natural environment, let's say you have an untouched nature, so like no people destroying forests, there's no construction going on, you basically have what we call an intact forest ecosystem. So what happens is that you have the captured carbon from the atmosphere. I mean, the atmosphere's carbon dioxide goes down, and about the same amount goes up. So you have this balance. What happens, of course, is that thanks to people, we totally upset this balance. So in one scenario, we have clearing and burning forests. So that releases carbon that has been stored in vegetation and soil. The other thing, of course, what we can do about that is that we can plant forests back, but I think it happens at such a slow rate that it's basically not sustainable in the long run. And anyway, even if you do plant trees, a tree doesn't grow overnight. It needs time, and we're talking long time, too long for what we need. So it takes decades to actually take effect. So the trees that we plant today, they will really have an effect maybe, I don't know, 20 years from now, really. So we don't really have this amount of time. And the final thing is conversion. So that's probably the worst. And this is when you do kind of everything. So you destroy the forest burn, and you basically reuse that land for pasture, agriculture, and urban areas. That is the worst way to generate CO2. In fact, I read somewhere that most of the crops that we grow are actually to feed animals. So we're talking about, chicken, pigs, and cows, and especially pigs and cows. I would actually go with chicken. Chicken is all right, but pigs and cows, they generate a lot of pollution. They need a lot of food, and that's just not sustainable. Once again, sustainable is the key word, it seems. The article continues. Bolsonaro wants to do as he'd like in the Amazon, 60% of which sits within Brazilian borders. There he plans to open the rainforest to agricultural development, essentially putting a match to an entire rainforest of stored carbon by inviting rapid deforestation. The industrial-scale felling of trees, which, in dying and decomposing, will release into the atmosphere all the CO2 they have stored inside them. So this goes back to the diagram I just showed a while ago. If you burn the forest, you release all that carbon that is stored there in the soil as well. Not a good thing to do. And why does he do that, by the way? It's only for short-term profits. A lot of the time, those, the fossil fuel companies and all of that, what they want is short-term profits. They actually perfectly know that climate change is happening. They perfectly know that they are causing it, but they are only concerned about how much money they can put into their bank tomorrow. That's basically it. And then I think what will happen is that eventually, maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now, as the fossil fuels in the world amount gets reduced, they will probably switch to solar or something like that, and then they will look like some savior. Hey, look at us, we're actually saving the planet now. So they made a lot of money from burning fossil fuels and destroying the planet, and they will make a lot of money from solar plants. But by that point, it may be too late anyway. We'll see how it goes. This is actually a picture. There was a show in the late 90s, I believe, called Sequest. Pretty good show. I do enjoy it. And, well, in a nutshell, most of the story actually happens under the water because it's about a submarine. But there are some occasional scenes from the ground as well. And the scenario was basically that humans have destroyed most of the forests in the world. So in this picture, for example, you only see some kind of bushes. Really, there are definitely no trees in the picture. Why? Because it's all gone. All of it destroyed. So then you might think, okay, well, then we don't have any oxygen because we still need some trees to produce oxygen. So what's their solution? Their solution is technology. So they build these huge towers, and I can't remember how many there are in the show, 8 or 10 in the world or something. Great target for terrorists, by the way. And so what they do is basically they produce oxygen. So I don't remember the mechanism. You'd have to watch the show again, but they basically create oxygen. And is that the future that we want? Is those ugly, not very aesthetically nice to look at? Is that what we want? Those huge towers just producing oxygen? I think nature deserves to be here. The article continues, Bolsonaro's deforestation would release the equivalent of 13.12 gigatons of carbon. Last year, the United States emitted about 5 gigatons. This means that this one policy would have between 2 and 3 times the annual carbon impact of the entire American economy. With all of its airplanes and automobiles and coal plants, the world's worst emitter by far is China. The country was responsible for 9.1 gigatons of emissions in 2017. But China is doing a lot of things, though, to reduce that. So yeah, China is producing a lot. Most of the stuff that we buy is made in China. So there is no extra, we don't pay extra for that, you see? So a dirty industry in China produces your goods, gets shipped over, and basically you don't really pay an extra tax on that product. There is no carbon tax that you pay in China, definitely. That's the thing, we take the air for granted. And air has no borders, so whatever happens in China gets blown all over the planet anyway, and as a result we all suffer. It's a free-for-all, just like the oceans. There's really, I mean, there are like kind of borderlines drawn in the ocean, but really the water flows all over. It doesn't care about these lines. These lines are kind of imaginary. So yeah, that's scary. That's a scary scenario here, that, you know, he would burn the thing and it would be twice or 3 times as much as what the entire United States emits. For years, scientists have worried that the world's forests would flip from carbon sinks to carbon sources, become net producers of carbon rather than net absorbers. In fact, this is one of the feedback loops they most worry about. The planet's not just losing one of its largest natural resources and mitigating the extreme possibilities of global warming, but having that resource turn against it, almost like a climate traitor, suddenly working on behalf of the most dire scenarios. Well, okay, we talked about this just a second ago. So yeah, it goes from a carbon sink to a carbon source. So the net carbon output becomes higher than what is absorbed. And that's what we call one of the feedback loops. And that's very scary indeed. More droughts in the rain forests also produce more wildfires, which delivered more. Okay, I'm just going to reread that for the edit later. More droughts in the rain forests also produce more wildfires, which delivered more than a gigaton of carbon between 2003 and 2015. Indeed, overall, the world's tropical forests are already carbon sources, on net responsible for almost half a gigaton of carbon each year. So this is already happening. So people found these weird articles online, like saying the Earth is getting greener and all of that. And what's your point? So yeah, enjoy your green, but in reality, CO2 is still increasing, not decreasing. So you might think like green plant might be a good thing, but you look at the curve and it's not. So one paper from a few years ago suggested that while many species in the Amazon have already gone extinct thanks to deforestation, 80 to 90% of extinctions are yet to come. These declines are unfortunately right in line with what's happening everywhere in the world and what is now indisputably underway, a mass extinction by human hands. So that's what I said at the beginning of the show. This is something that people have to accept now. And the next paragraph will explain that a little bit more, but this is scary. And I know that even in my lifetime, I heard these scary figures, like 60 to 70% of species are gone just in the last, well, now it will be the last 4 decades or something. And it's happening, it's happening all the time, and it's going to keep happening because nothing is being done. Yeah, there are some minor efforts here and there, but we're not tackling the big beast. We're not. It seems like people are so powerless to do anything that in the end people don't even care. Because, you know, if you can't change anything, if really all your efforts amount to nothing, then in the end you just kind of give up. And that's what the fossil fuel industry wants. They want literally people to give up, so they just have complete control over what's happening. A new study this week from the World Wildlife Federation found that globally wildlife populations have declined by 60% since just 1970. So that's what I just said. At rates 1,000 times faster than any previous point in planetary history. A discovery the WWF Director General called mind-blowing. Yeah, that's exactly it. It happens so quickly and we don't see it because everybody is so into their everyday life. You know, you go to work, you get tired there, you go home, you don't have time to do anything, you definitely don't have time to research stuff. Okay, some people do, and that's great, you know. You shouldn't have a cookie for that because everybody should be doing their responsibility to the planet. They should be educating themselves. That doesn't deserve any medal. Like, this is something you should do, period. So yeah, it happens at such a quick rate that the planet definitely, including the wildlife, it doesn't have the time to adjust to such abrupt change. So guess who's next? Us. The UK chief executive put the news in somewhat more eye-opening perspective. We are the first generation to know we are destroying our planet and the last one that can do anything about it. Well, again, yes, this is very true. It goes back to the thing about the very short timeline of this, because basically in my lifetime, I'm in my mid-30s now, this is happening. So this huge major global event is happening in just my lifetime. So we talk about long-term changes, like, I don't know, the big empires that last for centuries. The Greek Empire, for example, the Roman Empire is a better example. The Roman Empire was around for centuries, very strong, powerful, got destroyed by corruption, by the way, in the end, to a large extent. But this thing was not global, though. Roman Empire never reached, for example, the Americas, never reached Australia, or so it is still not quite the same comparison. But climate change is happening on a global change, and it's happening very, very quickly. And I think we are so used to things happening on a slow speed that we just cannot accept that these are happening so quickly. So that's why it gives birth to a lot of denialism, unfortunately. And the last picture here, this is still from the same article, but I just found it a bit curious because it ends with this note here. It's not hard to dream of an even stronger two-person front with Xi, so that's the Chinese president, working in partnership with the future President Warren or Harris or Booker, one area of cooperation and superpower relationship that seems otherwise destined for further conflict. This is so funny that they kind of put these three people in the same pot. So I have some issues with Warren. I mean, she did vote, for example, for the Trump military budget expansion. And that's a bit odd because, it's so weird to see that. And then next week she comes and talks about social issues or about how we should reinforce healthcare and reinvest into education. You just you just gave Trump an $80 billion check. What are you doing? What are all of you doing? But Harris and Booker, though, they are absolutely corporate shills. Argue with the hand. Okay, that's all for the show today. If you enjoy what I'm doing, then please subscribe and check out the merchandise. Check out the book I mentioned at the beginning of the show, and check out the shirts as well. You can buy shirts like this one. And I'll try to do this on a weekly basis, so if my health allows it. So I'll see you next week or just next time.